They told him the airplane was a death trap. The engineers said it. The test pilots said it. Even the men who built it said it. But on a frozen morning in February 1943, Second Lieutenant James Kellerman climbed into that cockpit anyway, 24,000 feet over the English Channel, and what happened next would haunt the Air Corps for decades. This is the story they buried in a classified file until 1987. Kellerman was 22 years old when he reported to the 384th Bomb Group at Grafton Underwood. He had that lean, hard look that farm work puts on a man. Grew up in Nebraska, learned to fly crop dusters over his father's wheat fields. The Army Air Corps took one look at his logbook and handed him the controls of a B-17 Flying Fortress. They called it the Flying Fortress because it was supposed to be invincible. Kellerman called it Lucille, after a girl back home who wrote him letters that smelled like lavender. The B-17F model had a reputation. It could take punishment that would tear other aircraft apart. Flak could shred the tail section, and the Fortress would still bring her crew home. Engine fires, hydraulic failures, half a wing missing. Men told stories in the mess hall about fortresses that landed themselves, practically flew on prayers and the sheer stubbornness of American engineering. But there was one airplane in the 384th that nobody wanted to fly, serial number 423943. The mechanics called her the Widow Maker. She had a problem that defied explanation. Every mission, without fail, something catastrophic would go wrong at altitude. The first crew that took her up reported total electrical failure at 20,000 feet. They limped home on dead reckoning and pure luck. The second crew experienced explosive decompression that nearly sucked the waist gunner out through a burst window seal. The third crew never made it to the target. Engine number 3 tore itself apart, sent shrapnel through the fuselage that wounded 2 men, and forced an emergency landing in a muddy field outside Dover. 3 crews, 3 near disasters, 3 requests to ground the aircraft permanently. But this was February 1943, and the 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers faster than factories could replace them. General Eaker needed every airplane in the air. High Command issued a direct order: fix the structural issues, get that fortress back in rotation, and stop the superstitious nonsense about cursed aircraft. The mechanics worked for 72 hours straight. They replaced the electrical system completely, reinforced the fuselage, rebuilt engine number 3 from the ground up. They went through that airplane with a level of detail that bordered on obsession. When they finished, the chief mechanic, a grizzled master sergeant from Pittsburgh named DeMarco, stood on the tarmac and looked at Kellerman with something like pity. He said the airplane was clean. He said every system checked out perfect. Then he said something else, something that stuck with Kellerman for the rest of his life. He said, "Lieutenant, that bird don't want to fly." Kellerman asked what he meant. DeMarco just shook his head. "Metal remembers, sir. That's all I'm saying. Metal remembers." The mission briefing came at 0400 hours. Target: submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. The Germans had reinforced those pens with concrete walls 15 feet thick. It would take a direct hit from every bomb in the formation to even crack the structure. Intelligence estimated heavy flak concentrations and probable fighter intercepts over the French coast. Expected losses: 15 to 20%. Standard odds for a daylight bombing run in 1943. Kellerman's crew filed into the briefing room, smelling like coffee and cigarette smoke. His co-pilot was a kid from Michigan named Patterson, barely 20 years old, with hands that never stopped shaking before a mission. The bombardier was a former mathematics professor from Boston named Kowalski, who calculated bombing solutions in his head faster than the Norden bomb sight. The navigator, Chen, had emigrated from San Francisco and spoke 3 languages. The rest of the crew, 6 men total, were a mix of farm boys and factory workers who had become brothers in the frozen hell of high-altitude combat. They drew their aircraft assignment from the operations board, serial number 423943. Patterson went pale. Kowalski swore under his breath. Chen made the sign of the cross, and Chen never did that. Kellerman told them to knock it off. He said the airplane was fixed. He said they had a job to do. He said a lot of things he didn't quite believe, but leadership meant lying with conviction sometimes. And these men needed conviction more than they needed honesty. They walked to the hardstand in the pre-dawn darkness. The fortress loomed against the sky like a sleeping giant. Ground crews were loading the bomb bay, 500-pounders nestled in their racks, each one painted with messages for Hitler. Ammunition belts fed into the turrets. Fuel trucks topped off the tanks. Everything looked normal. Everything looked right. DeMarco stood near the nose wheel, smoking a cigarette. Kellerman stopped. "Something you want to say, Sergeant?" DeMarco took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "Checked her 3 times, Lieutenant. She's perfect. But if something happens up there, you get your boys out. You don't try to save the airplane. You understand me?" Kellerman said he understood. He didn't understand. Not yet. The pre-flight check took 20 minutes. Every gauge, every control surface, every backup system. Patterson called out the checklist items, and Kellerman verified each one. Oil pressure, normal. Fuel flow, normal. Hydraulics, normal. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines coughed to life one by one, settling into that deep, synchronized roar that made the whole airframe vibrate. It felt good. It felt powerful. It felt like any other mission. The tower cleared them for takeoff at 06:15. Kellerman released the brakes, and the Fortress rolled down the runway, picking up speed, the tailwheel lifting, and then that moment of transition when the wings took the weight and the Earth fell away. They climbed through broken cloud cover into a sky that was turning the color of cold steel. The formation assembled over the channel. 36 bombers, stacked in combat boxes with P-47 Thunderbolt escorts weaving above them like protective hawks. They crossed the French coast at 22,000 feet. The flak started immediately. Black puffs of smoke that appeared out of nowhere, close enough to rock the airplane, close enough to smell the cordite through the oxygen mask. The German 80mm guns were terrifyingly accurate. Kellerman had seen flak tear the wing off a Fortress in a single hit. He had seen it decapitate a tail gunner. He flew straight and level anyway because that's what you did. The bombardier needed a stable platform, and Kellerman would give him that stable platform even if the sky was full of flying metal. They were 40 minutes from the target when it happened. Engine number 2 lost power. Not gradually, not with warning signs. One moment it was running perfectly, the next moment it was windmilling dead. Patterson called it out, and Kellerman feathered the prop, adjusted the trim, compensated with throttle on the other 3 engines. A single engine failure was manageable. The Fortress could fly on 3 engines. She could fly on 2 if she had to. Then engine number 1 started running rough. Kellerman felt it through the controls before he saw it on the gauges. A vibration that shouldn't exist. Oil pressure dropping. Cylinder head temperature climbing into the red. He pulled the power back, tried to baby it, tried to keep it alive long enough to reach the target. Then the electrical system died. Everything went dark. Radio dead. Intercom dead. Instruments powered by the backup generator only. No communication with the crew, no communication with the formation. Kellerman looked at Patterson, and Patterson looked back with eyes that said they were already dead, but they weren't at 24,000 feet yet. Kellerman made a decision. He would not abort. He would not break formation. His orders were to reach the target and deliver his bombs. And that's exactly what he intended to do, because the men in the other fortresses were depending on every single bomber to hit that submarine pen, and if he turned back, if he gave up, then maybe some U-boat would slip out into the Atlantic and sink a convoy, and maybe American soldiers would drown in the dark water, and Kellerman would not carry that weight. So he kept flying. Engine number 1 seized completely at 23,000 feet. The prop locked up with a sound like a cannon shot. Metal fragments punched through the cowling. The airplane shuddered, yawed hard to the left. Kellerman stood on the right rudder pedal with everything he had, both hands on the yoke, fighting to keep the Fortress in formation. They climbed to 24,000 feet on 2 engines. The bomber stream stretched out ahead of them, 35 other Fortresses in perfect formation, and Kellerman's airplane hung at the back like a wounded animal trying to keep up with the herd. He could see the lead bombardier's airplane in the distance. When that airplane dropped its bombs, every other bombardier would toggle their release at the same moment. That's how formation bombing worked. Precision through overwhelming volume. The target appeared below them through gaps in the cloud cover. The submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, gray concrete bunkers squatting on the coast like malignant growths. The flak intensified. The Germans knew exactly where the bombers were going, and they filled the sky with steel. A Fortress off the right wing took a direct hit and exploded, just ceased to exist in a fireball that tumbled toward the earth in burning pieces. Kellerman saw it in his peripheral vision, but he didn't look away from the formation. He couldn't look away. He had to hold position. He had to stay in the bombing pattern. Engine number 4 started smoking. Black smoke, thick and oily, streaming from the cowling. Patterson was yelling something, but Kellerman couldn't hear him without the intercom. He pointed at the engine and made a cutting motion across his throat. Patterson pulled the fire suppression handle. The smoke continued. They were 60 seconds from bomb release. The Fortress was dying. Kellerman could feel it in his bones. The airframe was rattling itself apart. The controls felt mushy, unresponsive. Engine number 3 was screaming at maximum power, trying to carry the entire airplane by itself. And any moment now, it would fail too, and they would fall out of the sky like a stone. 30 seconds to bomb release. Kellerman held the yoke with both hands and both knees. He flew by feel, by instinct, by sheer force of will. The airplane wanted to roll inverted. The airplane wanted to spin. The airplane wanted to die. But Kellerman had made a promise to himself, to his crew, to every man in every other fortress in the formation. He would deliver his bombs. He would complete the mission. 15 seconds. The lead bombardier's fortress released. Kellerman saw the bomb bay doors open, saw the bombs tumble out into space, dark shapes against the clouds. 10 seconds. He reached for the bomb release toggle. His hand was shaking. The whole airplane was shaking. 5 seconds. Engine number 3 exploded. Not failed. Exploded. The entire engine tore free from its mounts and tumbled backward over the wing, trailing fire and oil. The fortress snap-rolled to the right. Kellerman was slammed against the side of the cockpit. Patterson's head hit the canopy frame. The world spun. Sky, ground, sky, ground. Kellerman pulled the bomb release anyway. 5,000 pounds of high explosive dropped free. The fortress lurched upward with the sudden weight loss. Kellerman caught the roll, fought the spin, pulled the nose toward level flight with every ounce of strength he had left. They were at 24,000 feet with one engine and no hydraulics and no electrical power and no prayer of making it back to England. The fortress was a glider now, a 30-ton glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. Kellerman aimed for the coast. If he could reach the channel, if he could ditch near a rescue boat, maybe some of his crew would survive. Maybe. They descended through the flak field. The German gunners saw the crippled bomber and focused their fire. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The plexiglass nose shattered. Kowalski took fragments in his shoulder, but kept his position, kept watching for fighters. Chen was calculating their glide ratio, their distance to the coast, their chances of survival. The numbers weren't good. 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet. The French coast appeared ahead, a thin line between the land and the sea. Kellerman could see individual buildings now, roads, vehicles. The fortress was descending at 2,000 feet per minute. The remaining engine was redlining, melting itself, screaming its death song. He shut it down. The sudden silence was profound, just the wind whistling through holes in the fuselage and the creak of stressed metal. They crossed the coast at 4,000 feet. The English Channel spread out below them, gray water with whitecaps. It looked cold. It looked impossibly far away. Kellerman started the ditching checklist from memory. Crew positions, inflate life vests, prepare for impact. He couldn't tell them any of that because the intercom was dead, but he saw Patterson moving through the cockpit, saw him disappear into the fuselage to warn the others. 2,000 feet. The fortress was gliding remarkably well for an aircraft that shouldn't be able to glide at all. Kellerman had the nose up, just above stall speed, stretching every foot of altitude into maximum distance. He could see the cliffs of Dover in the distance. 30 miles. They weren't going to make 30 miles. 1,000 feet. Patterson came back to the cockpit. His face was white. He shook his head. The crew in the rear couldn't get out. The fuselage damage was too severe. The escape hatches were jammed. The waist gunners, the tail gunner, the ball turret gunner, they were trapped. Kellerman looked at Patterson. Patterson looked back. They both understood what that meant. If Kellerman ditched in the channel, 4 men would drown before rescue boats could reach them. He had one other option. The cliffs of Dover had a small emergency airfield carved into the chalk hills. It was designed for fighters, for light aircraft. It had a runway, maybe 1,500 feet long, surrounded by trees and rocks and steep drop-offs. No bomber had ever landed there. The runway was too short. The approach was too difficult. It was impossible. Kellerman turned toward Dover. 500 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. The white cliffs rose ahead of them like a wall. Kellerman could see the airfield now, a tiny strip of grass perched on top of the cliff. He could see people running, pointing, shouting into radios. They knew what he was trying to do. They knew it was suicide. 200 feet. The fortress was barely flying. The airspeed indicator was bouncing on stall speed. 1 degree nose up, and they would drop out of the sky. 1 degree nose down, and they would hit the water before reaching the cliff. 100 feet. Kellerman pulled back on the yoke. The fortress climbed, using its last bit of momentum to claw up the cliff face. Chalk and dirt blurred past the cockpit windows. The engines were silent. The only sound was the wind, and Kellerman's breathing, and his heart hammering in his chest. 50 feet. The cliff edge. The fortress cleared it by 10 feet. The emergency airfield appeared directly ahead. 1,500 feet of grass, lined with trees. Kellerman dumped the nose. The fortress fell like a stone, wings level, aligned with the runway. He had no flaps, no airspeed, no margin for error. The wheels touched grass. Kellerman stood on the brakes. Nothing happened. No hydraulics. He pulled the emergency brake handle. The tailwheel locked, but the mains just skidded. The fortress slid down the runway, losing speed, but not enough, not nearly enough. The trees at the far end were coming up fast. Patterson was praying. Kellerman could see his lips moving. Kellerman yanked the yoke full back and full left. The fortress ground-looped, the tail swinging around, scrubbing speed in a controlled spin. Metal screamed. The left main landing gear collapsed. The wing dipped, caught the ground, and the fortress pivoted on the wingtip, spinning like a compass needle. They stopped 20 feet from the trees. The silence was absolute. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Kellerman sat in the cockpit for a long time. His hands wouldn't release the yoke. Patterson was laughing or crying, or maybe both. Someone was pounding on the cockpit door from the fuselage. Emergency crews were running toward the aircraft with fire extinguishers and ambulances. The crew climbed out through the shattered nose. All 10 men. Not a single fatality. Kowalski had shrapnel wounds. The tail gunner had a concussion. Patterson's hands finally stopped shaking about 3 hours later. But they were alive. Every single one of them was alive. DeMarco arrived at the crash site that afternoon. He walked around the wreckage slowly, taking notes, examining the engines. He spent an hour in the cockpit, checking the controls, the electrical systems, the hydraulics. Then he found Kellerman in the medical tent. He said, "Lieutenant, I went through that airplane bolt by bolt. You want to know what I found?" Kellerman said he wanted to know. DeMarco pulled out a small piece of metal. It was a lock wire, the kind mechanics use to safety-critical bolts. This was installed backwards on the number 2 engine fuel pump. Backwards. That pump was feeding air into the fuel line every time it cycled. That's what killed number 2. He pulled out another piece. This is a cotter pin from the oil pressure regulator on number 1. Wrong size, 0.5 millimeter too small. That regulator was letting oil bypass the engine. That's what killed number 1. He pulled out a third piece. This is an electrical connector from the main bus. Someone installed it without the locking collar. It vibrated loose at altitude. That's why you lost electrical. Kellerman stared at the pieces. Sabotage? DeMarco shook his head. Incompetence. 3 different mechanics. 3 different mistakes, all on the same airplane. The odds of that are astronomical, but it happened. What about engine 3? That one exploded. DeMarco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That one I can't explain, Lieutenant. That engine was perfect. We rebuilt it ourselves. Every part was new. Every tolerance was exact. It should have run for 1,000 hours without a hiccup. But it didn't. No, sir, it didn't. That engine tore itself apart for no reason I can find." They stood in silence. Finally, DeMarco said what they were both thinking. "That airplane didn't want to fly, sir. I told you that. Metal remembers. Kellerman never flew serial number 423943 again. Neither did anyone else. High Command quietly retired the aircraft, stripped it for parts, and scattered those parts across a dozen different bombers in a dozen different squadrons. The official record listed the aircraft as destroyed in a training accident. But that wasn't the end of the story. 3 months later, a B-17 from the 303rd Bomb Group experienced catastrophic engine failure over Hamburg. Number 3 engine exploded without warning, exactly like Kellerman's number 3. The Fortress made it back to England on a wing and a prayer. When mechanics investigated, they found that engine had originally been salvaged from serial number 423943. 2 weeks after that, a Fortress from the 91st Bomb Group lost all electrical power at altitude over France. Total system failure, no warning, no explanation. They limped home in radio silence and landed safely. The electrical components had come from 423943. Over the next 6 months, 11 different aircraft experienced catastrophic failures related to part salvage from the Widowmaker. 11 aircraft, 11 near disasters, not a single fatality, which was its own kind of miracle, but the pattern was undeniable. The Air Corps quietly tracked down every part from serial number 423943 and removed them from service. Some were destroyed, some were buried, some were locked in a warehouse in Alabama and forgotten. The official explanation was material fatigue, stress fractures, normal wear and tear. The mechanics had a different explanation. They said the airplane was trying to kill someone. They said it failed with Kellerman and spent the rest of its existence trying to finish what it started. They said metal remembers, and this particular metal remembered rage. Kellerman flew 23 more combat missions before the war ended. He brought his crew home every single time. Not a scratch, not a casualty. He had a reputation for being lucky, for being blessed, for being untouchable. But he never forgot that flight at 24,000 feet. Years later, after the war, after the medals and the parades and the slow return to normal life, a reporter asked Kellerman about his most difficult mission. He could have talked about the raid on Berlin. He could have talked about the mission over Schweinfurt where they lost half the bomb group. He could have talked about a dozen different missions that earned him decorations for valor. Instead, he talked about serial number 423943. He said, "That airplane taught me something important. It taught me that sometimes the enemy isn't the flak or the fighters or the mission. Sometimes the enemy is the machine you're sitting in. Sometimes you're fighting your own equipment just to survive long enough to fight the real war." The reporter asked if he believed the airplane was cursed. Kellerman thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I believe that airplane was built by people who were tired, who were overworked, who made mistakes. I believe those mistakes compounded into something dangerous. But I also believe there are things in war that can't be explained by mechanics or physics. I believe there are aircraft that develop a personality, a will, a desire. And I believe that when you strap yourself into a machine like that, you better be prepared to fight it every second you're in the air." The reporter asked if he would do it again. Kellerman smiled. "Every morning I wake up and I'm grateful to be alive. Every morning I think about the men who didn't make it home. And every morning I tell myself that if I had to make that same decision, if I had to climb into that cockpit knowing what I know now, I would do it. Because that's what we signed up for. That's what the uniform meant. You don't get to choose your aircraft. You don't get to choose your mission. You just do the job and you bring your boys home." He paused. "And if the airplane tries to kill you, you kill it right back." The story of serial number 423943 remained classified until 1987, when the Air Force released a collection of incident reports from World War II. Buried in those reports was a single paragraph about an aircraft that experienced multiple catastrophic failures across different squadrons after being salvaged for parts. The paragraph ended with a recommendation that certain aircraft be retired completely rather than cannibalized for components, citing unexplained mechanical phenomena that defied standard analysis. The recommendation was never implemented. The military needed every part they could salvage. Waste was not acceptable during wartime, but the mechanics remembered. They passed the story down through generations. The crew chiefs who worked on B-17s told their apprentices about the Widowmaker. Those apprentices became mechanics on B-29s and told the story to the next generation working on B-52s. The story evolved, changed, grew embellishments and mythology, but the core remained the same. Some airplanes don't want to fly. Some machines carry a darkness that can't be fixed with wrenches and replacement parts. And when you encounter a machine like that, you document the problems, you follow the procedures, and you get the hell away from it as fast as possible. Kellerman lived to be 89 years old. He never flew commercially. He said he had used up his lifetime allocation of flight hours over the skies of Europe, and he was content to keep his feet on the ground. He attended reunions with his crew every year. They stayed close, those 10 men. The kind of close that only comes from shared survival. Patterson became a teacher. Kowalski went back to mathematics and spent 30 years at MIT. Chen opened a restaurant in San Francisco that became a neighborhood institution. The gunners and engineers scattered across the country became fathers and grandfathers, lived quiet lives marked by nightmares they never discussed. But once a year, they gathered. They told stories. They drank toasts to absent friends. And they always ended the night with the same question. What really happened at 24,000 feet? Was it mechanical failure? Was it sabotage? Was it something else entirely? Something that existed in the space between rational explanation and superstition? They never agreed on an answer, but they all agreed on one thing. That airplane was trying to kill them, and James Kellerman wouldn't let it. DeMarco, the crew chief, died in 1969. He spent his last years working at a small airport in Pennsylvania, teaching young mechanics the trade. His students remembered him as demanding, precise, and deeply superstitious about aircraft. He had a saying that he repeated to every mechanic who trained under him. Listen to the airplane. If it tells you something's wrong, believe it. If it tells you to walk away, because metal remembers, and metal doesn't forgive. One of his former students found a journal after DeMarco died. It was full of notes, diagrams, observations about different aircraft he had worked on over 4 decades. Most of it was technical, mundane documentation of repairs and maintenance schedules, but scattered throughout the journal were entries about aircraft that refused to be fixed, planes that developed recurring problems despite perfect maintenance, machines that seemed to resist every attempt at repair, as if they were fighting back against the mechanics who tried to heal them. The final entry in the journal, written 3 days before DeMarco's death, was about serial number 423943. It read, "Saw Lieutenant Kellerman at the reunion in Dayton. Still sharp, still carries himself like an officer. He asked me if I ever figured out what was wrong with that bird. I told him the same thing I told him in 1943. Some metal remembers. Some machines hold on to the fear and pain and death that happens around them. That fortress saw 3 crews nearly die before Kellerman took her up. She absorbed all that terror, all that trauma. and when Kellerman climbed into that cockpit, the airplane tried to add his crew to the collection. But Kellerman was stronger than the machine. He bent it to his will through sheer stubbornness and skill. He didn't let it win. That's the real story. Not that the airplane was cursed, but that one pilot refused to accept the curse. The journal is currently held by the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It's not on public display, but researchers can request access, and those who read it come away with a profound respect for the mechanics who kept the bombers flying during the darkest days of the war. The official Air Force history of the 384th Bomb Group mentions serial number 423943 exactly once, in a footnote about aircraft that were retired due to chronic maintenance issues. The footnote is 3 sentences long and contains no information about the dramatic landing at Dover, the multiple engine failures, or the subsequent problems with salvaged parts. History, it seems, prefers clean narratives. But the men who were there, who lived through it, who fought that airplane and won, they know the truth. They carry it with them. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In 2003, a team of aviation archaeologists located wreckage from a B-17 in a field outside Saint-Nazaire. The aircraft had been shot down during the same raid that Kellerman survived. The forensic analysis determined it was one of the fortresses that exploded in the air, the one Kellerman saw disintegrate off his right wing. They found the remains of 11 crew members, 11 men, when a B-17 only carried 10. The extra set of remains was never identified. DNA analysis was inconclusive. The bones were buried with full military honors at the American Cemetery in Normandy, under a headstone that reads, "Unknown American Airmen." But some of the archaeologists who worked on the excavation reported strange experiences during the dig. Equipment failures, unexplained sounds, a feeling of being watched. One researcher quit the project entirely, citing an overwhelming sense of dread that she couldn't shake. The lead archaeologist dismissed these reports as stress and imagination. But privately, in his field notes, he wrote, "This wreckage carries a weight that goes beyond metal and history. There's something here that doesn't want to be disturbed. I've excavated 30 crash sites in my career. This is the only one that made me want to leave before the work was finished." The wreckage was eventually moved to a storage facility in France, where it remains today. Researchers occasionally request access to study the fragments, trying to understand the structural failures that brought the fortress down. The metal is corroded, brittle, marked by fire and violence. But according to the facility manager, there's something unusual about these particular fragments. They're cold to the touch, even on warm days, and the storage room where they're kept requires more heating than other rooms, as if the metal itself is draining warmth from the air. These reports are anecdotal, unscientific, easily dismissed. But the facility manager, a rational woman with a degree in material science, won't enter that storage room alone. She says it's just policy, just procedure, just common sense. But her hands shake when she unlocks the door. Kellerman never visited the crash site. He never went back to Grafton Underwood or Dover or any of the places where he flew during the war. He said the past should stay in the past, and there was no value in reopening old wounds. But on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, he gave a speech at a memorial service in Nebraska. The speech was brief, less than 5 minutes. He talked about duty and sacrifice and the cost of freedom. Standard themes for a veteran's address. But at the end, he deviated from his prepared remarks. He said, "I flew with men who were braver than I could ever be. I flew an aircraft that should have fallen from the sky, but somehow kept flying. And I learned that war is not about the big decisions, the strategic plans, the movements of armies. War is about the moment when everything is going wrong, when the machine is failing, when death is certain, and you have to choose whether to quit or to keep fighting. That choice, that single moment of decision, that's what defines us. Not our medals, not our records, but the moment when we looked at the impossible and said, 'Watch me do it anyway.'" The crowd gave him a standing ovation. But Kellerman wasn't finished. He looked out at the audience, at the faces of veterans and their families, and he said, "If you take nothing else from my story, remember this. The machine doesn't control you. The circumstances don't control you. Fear doesn't control you. You control yourself. And if you're strong enough, if you're stubborn enough, if you refuse to accept defeat even when defeat is the logical outcome, then you can accomplish things that physics says are impossible. You can land a bomber with no engines. You can bring your crew home when every indicator says they should be dead. You can look at the cursed, broken, dying machine and make it obey your will one more time." He paused. "And that, more than anything else, is what I want you to remember about the men who fought in that war. We didn't win because we had better equipment. We didn't win because we were smarter or tougher or more prepared. We won because when everything was going wrong, when the airplane was falling apart, when the mission was impossible, we refused to quit. We made the decision every single day to do the job no matter what the cost. That's what saved my crew at 24,000 feet. Not luck, not skill, not the grace of God, though I prayed plenty during that flight. What saved us was the decision to keep flying when the airplane told us to give up, to keep fighting when the machine told us to die, to reject the curse and impose our will on metal and physics and fate itself. The speech became famous in veteran circles. It was reprinted in military journals, quoted in books, referenced in documentaries. But the text never quite captured the weight of Kellerman's delivery, the way his voice broke when he talked about his crew, the way his hands gripped the podium like he was still holding the yoke of a dying bomber. The people who were there that day said it was the most honest thing they had ever heard. No jingoism, no false heroics, just the raw truth of what it meant to fight a war where the machines you depended on could turn against you at any moment. Kellerman died in 2009, on a Tuesday morning in November. His family was with him. His crew, those who were still alive, came to say goodbye. Patterson held his hand and cried like a child. Kowalski read mathematics equations in a soft voice, the kind of useless calculation that had kept them sane during bomb runs. Chen brought food and insisted everyone eat, because that's what you did when someone was dying. You made sure the living were fed. The funeral was quiet. A flag-draped coffin, a 3-volley salute, taps played on a bugle that sounded thin and lonely in the cold air. He was buried in Nebraska, in the same cemetery as his parents, under a simple headstone that listed his name, his rank, and his dates of service. The inscription read, "He brought them home." No mention of serial number 423943. No mention of the impossible landing at Dover. Just 6 words that summarized an entire life. After the funeral, Patterson approached Kellerman's son. He handed him a small metal box. "Your father wanted you to have this," Patterson said. Inside the box was a piece of twisted aluminum, a fragment of fuselage metal from serial number 423943. Kellerman had kept it for 66 years, carried it with him through moves and marriages and all the changes that life brings. On the back of the metal, scratched in careful letters, was a message: "The machine does not win." Kellerman's son asked Patterson what it meant. Patterson smiled, sad and tired and old. "It means your father fought a war against more than just the Germans. He fought against fate, against probability, against a machine that wanted him dead. And he won. Every day for the rest of his life, he won." That medal was his reminder, his proof, his trophy. Why did he keep it? Because some victories are so hard won that you need physical evidence they actually happened. Because some battles are so impossible that you need to hold the proof in your hand. Continue REO 743 to believe you survived them. Patterson's voice got quiet. And because your father understood that the real enemy wasn't the airplane. The real enemy was giving up, and he never ever gave up. The piece of metal now sits in a display case at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. It's labeled simply as Fuselage Fragment from B-17F, 384th Bomb Group, 1943. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. It's just a twisted piece of aluminum, corroded and unremarkable. But veterans stop. They lean close. They read the scratched inscription. And sometimes, if you watch carefully, you can see them nod. A small gesture of understanding, of recognition, of respect. They know what that metal represents. They know the story, even if they never heard Kellerman's name. Because every veteran has a story about the time the machine failed, the time the equipment broke, the time everything went wrong and death was certain. And the veterans who are standing in that museum looking at that fragment of metal are the ones who refuse to accept that certainty. They're the ones who fought back. They're the ones who made the impossible choice to keep going when logic said to quit. They're the ones who won their own battles against fate and probability and machines that wanted them dead. The inscription on that metal, "The machine does not win," is more than just Kellerman's personal motto. It's a philosophy, a declaration, a promise made by every person who ever climbed into a cockpit or a tank or a ship and bet their life on their ability to overcome the limitations of the machine beneath them. Kellerman understood that. He lived it, and he made sure that understanding survived him, preserved in a fragment of the very airplane that tried to kill him. That's the real legacy of serial number 423943. Not the mechanical failures or the near disasters or the impossible landing. The real legacy is the lesson Kellerman carried for the rest of his life. You are stronger than the machine. You are stronger than the circumstances. You are stronger than fear, and if you refuse to give up, if you keep fighting even when the airplane is falling apart around you, if you impose your will on metal and physics and fate itself, then you can accomplish things that should be impossible. You can bring your crew home. You can land a dead bomber on a clifftop runway built for fighters. You can look at 24,000 feet of falling, burning, dying aircraft and say, "Not today." That's what James Kellerman did on a frozen morning in February 1943. He made a decision. He kept flying. He refused to let the machine win. And 70 years later, that decision still echoes, still matters, still teaches us something essential about courage and stubbornness and the raw human will to survive against impossible odds. The machine does not win, not if you refuse to let it. That's the story they buried in a classified file. That's the truth about what happened at 24,000 feet over the English Channel when a pilot named Kellerman flew a bomber that wanted him dead and brought every single member of his crew home alive. Some called it luck, some called it skill, some called it divine intervention. Kellerman called it duty, the choice to do the job no matter how impossible, no matter how terrifying, no matter what the machine was telling him. And in the end, that choice made all the difference between life and death, between giving up and pushing through, between becoming another statistic in the casualty reports and walking away from a crashed bomber with your crew in the choice to reject the curse, to fight the machine, to impose your will on fate itself. That's what saved them. That's what brought them home. That's what kept them alive when serial number 423943 did everything in its considerable power to add 10 more names to the list of the dead. But James Kellerman said no, and that simple refusal, that stubborn rejection of the inevitable, changed everything. For him, for his crew, for everyone who heard the story and understood its deepest lesson. You are not a passenger in your own life. You're the pilot. And no matter how badly the aircraft is failing, no matter how impossible the odds, you still have a choice. You can accept defeat, or you can keep your hands on the controls and fly that broken machine until it obeys your will or kills you trying. Kellerman chose to fly, and that choice echoed through decades, through generations, through every person who heard his story and understood that the machine does not win unless you let it. That's the truth they didn't want you to see. That's what happened at 24,000 feet that February morning in 1943. One pilot, one impossible decision, one absolute refusal to give up, and 10 men who walked away from a dead bomber because their pilot was too stubborn to let the machine have the final word.